The last room. The old Blue Mountain Hotel stood alone at the end of the winding road. It had been abandoned for almost 3 decades, ever since that terrible incident that no one in the village talked about. Maria looked at it now from the window of her car, with a mixture of fascination and fear. As a photographer specializing in abandoned places, she had visited dozens of ruined buildings, but she had never felt this tightness in her chest before even entering. It will only be a couple of hours, she told herself as she grabbed her backpack from the back seat. I'll be back in town before nightfall. The gray sky threatened a storm, and the wind violently moved the branches of the trees surrounding the 5-story building. Maria adjusted her camera and began walking towards the main entrance. The doors hung from their hinges as if someone had torn them off in fury. The lobby still retained remnants of its former elegance. A crystal chandelier, now covered in cobwebs, hung precariously from the ceiling. The reception desk was covered in dust and dried leaves that the wind had blown inside. Maria began taking pictures, capturing the contrast between the current decay and what was once a luxurious place. As she walked down the main hallway, she noticed that it was absolutely silent. She couldn't even hear the wind blowing furiously outside. "Hello?" she said almost without thinking, and her voice bounced off the walls like a strange, distorted echo. No one answered, of course. She was alone. Or so she thought. The first floor contained the old restaurant. Knocked-over tables, broken chairs, and shattered crockery littered the floor. Maria meticulously photographed every corner, wondering what had happened to make everything look like this, as if the diners had fled in the middle of dinner. As she ascended the stairs to the second floor, she heard something. A rustling sound like fabric dragging across the floor. She stopped, holding her breath. "Is anyone there?" she asked, her voice more firm this time. The sound stopped immediately. "Probably rats," she muttered and continued up. The rooms on the second floor were practically untouched. Beds made, closets closed, as if waiting for guests who never came. Maria thought it was strange. Normally, abandoned places suffered vandalism, but here it seemed that no one had dared to enter since the hotel closed its doors. In room 217 she found something disturbing. An open suitcase on the bed with women's clothes neatly folded. A hairbrush with blonde hair was still on the dresser. Maria felt a chill. It was as if the guest had left momentarily and was going to return at any moment. She took some photographs and quickly left. The third floor was different. Here there were signs of destruction. Doors torn off, furniture smashed, walls with strange marks as if someone had desperately scratched the wallpaper. Maria stopped in front of some marks that seemed to form words. "Don't go into room 512. Please don't go in." A chill ran down her spine. Room 512 must have been on the 5th floor. Something told her she should leave, but her professional curiosity was stronger. The 4th floor was completely burned. A fire had consumed everything, leaving only charred skeletons of what had once been furniture and structures. The smell of smoke lingered even though the fire had happened decades ago. Maria had to cover her nose as she carefully walked across the blackened floor. Her boots left footprints in the ash. She took some pictures of the devastating scene and headed for the stairs leading to the 5th floor. That was when she heard it again. It wasn't a scuff this time, but a whisper. Clear and close. "Go away." Maria froze in place. It wasn't her imagination. She had heard that word perfectly, spoken very close to her ear. "Who's there?" she shouted, her heart pounding violently in her chest. Only silence answered. After a few minutes, she gathered enough courage to continue. The stairs to the 5th floor were in better condition than she expected. She climbed slowly, with each step heavier than the last, as if an invisible force was trying to stop her from moving forward. The hallway on the 5th floor was spotless. Red carpet, walls with flowery wallpaper, wall lamps that obviously didn't work but remained intact. It contrasted violently with the state of the rest of the hotel. Maria walked down the hallway looking at the room numbers. 508, 509, 510, 511. She stopped in front of the door to room 512. Unlike the others, this one was closed. Her instinct screamed at her to get away, but her hand moved almost involuntarily to the doorknob. It was cold, unusually cold. She turned it slowly. The door opened noiselessly. Room 512 was dark, the curtains drawn shut out the light. Maria turned on the flashlight on her phone and what she saw left her paralyzed. The room was perfectly tidy, but the walls, the ceiling, even the floor were covered in photographs. Thousands of photographs. And all of them were of Maria. Maria entering abandoned buildings, Maria sleeping in her house, Maria eating in restaurants, Maria as a child. Her entire life was there, documented with terrifying precision. In the center of the room was a chair, and sitting in it, a figure with his back to the door. "I was waiting for you," said a voice that sounded like her own, but distorted as if it were coming from an old gramophone. The figure began to turn slowly. Maria wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She wanted to scream, but her voice was gone. The figure finished turning and Maria saw her own face, but it was broken, with an impossibly wide smile that revealed too many teeth. "Now you can stay forever," her other self said, standing up. "Like all of us." It was then that Maria noticed that they were not alone in the room. In the corners, hidden in the shadows, were dozens of motionless figures watching her. "We are all you," the entity with its face continued. "We all come for the same reason, we all stay for the same reason." The figures began to advance towards her. They all had her face in different states of decomposition. Maria finally regained mobility and turned to flee, but the door was gone. There was only wall, covered with more photographs of her. "There is no exit from the last room," the voice whispered behind her, now just behind her neck. Maria felt cold fingers on her shoulder. "Welcome home." A month later, a young photographer with a taste for abandoned places parked his car in front of the Montaña Azul Hotel. He had read about Maria Salgado's disappearance and wanted to investigate on his own. As he walked towards the entrance, he didn't notice the figure watching him from the window of room 512. A figure smiling with too many teeth, holding a camera identical to his own. The echo of the halls. Daniel had never believed in superstitions. As a psychiatrist at San Rafael Psychiatric Hospital, his world was ruled by diagnoses, medications and therapies. Not by ghosts or curses. So when he was assigned to the night shift in the East Wing, the oldest wing in the hospital, he simply nodded and accepted his new routine. "Be careful with room 23, Teresa," the head nurse, warned him as she handed him the master keys that first night. "Patients who sleep there tend to change." Daniel smiled indulgently. After 15 years in the career, he was used to the stories that circulated among the medical staff. "Change how?" he asked, more out of courtesy than real interest. Teresa hesitated before answering, her eyes avoiding Daniel's. "Let's just say they go in one person and come out another," she murmured. "And it's best not to spend too much time in there. Especially after midnight." Daniel nodded absently as he looked over the patient files. The East Wing housed 25 people with a variety of disorders, from schizophrenia to severe personality disorders. Room 23 was currently occupied by Ana Herrera, a 34-year-old woman diagnosed with an unspecified dissociative disorder. "Good evening, Dr. Garcia," Teresa said goodbye, leaving him alone in the nurse's office. "And remember, if you hear footsteps in the hallway after 2 in the morning, don't go out looking. All of our patients are sedated at that time." Daniel smiled again. These old hospitals were always full of urban legends. The first few hours of his shift went by normally. He made his rounds, checked that all the patients were asleep, and returned to the office to write up some reports. At 1 in the morning, a piercing scream broke the silence. Daniel jumped up, quickly locating the source. Room 23. He ran down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing off the white-tiled walls. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently, creating eerie shadows that seemed to follow him. When he reached room 23, he found Ana sitting on her bed, her eyes wide and fixed on the opposite wall. "Ana? I'm Dr. Garcia. Are you okay?" he asked, cautiously entering. The woman slowly turned her head toward him. Her eyes, once brown according to the file, were now a pale gray, almost translucent. "He's coming," she whispered in a voice that didn't sound like her own. "He always comes at this time to take someone away." Daniel pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and checked Anna's pupils. They were reacting normally. "Who's coming, Anna?" he asked, adopting a professional tone. "The doctor," she replied as if it were obvious. "The one who worked here before. The one who never left." Daniel quickly consulted Anna's chart. There was no mention of specific delusions about doctors or hospital staff. "I'm going to give you something to help you sleep, okay?" he said, preparing a dose of lorazepam. Anna smiled, an odd smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It won't do any good." "He's already here," she said, pointing behind Daniel. Involuntarily, Daniel glanced over his shoulder. No one was there, of course. After administering the sedative, he waited until Anna fell asleep and returned to the office. As he walked down the hall, he noticed that the temperature had dropped sharply. He could see his own breath forming little clouds in front of him. "Faulty HVAC system," he muttered to himself, rubbing his arms for warmth. "De vuelta en la oficina," busco en los archivos alguna información sobre la historia del hospital. Encontró un viejo álbum de fotos de cuando el edificio fue inaugurado en 1932. Pasó las páginas amarillentas con cuidado, observando los rostros seriosos de médicos y enfermeras pasando formalmente. Se detuvo en una fotografía grupal del personal original. En el centro, un hombre de mediana edad con gafas redondas y expresión severa sostenía una placa que lo identificaba como Dr. Ernesto Vidal, director. Había algo inquietante en su mirada. Daniel continuó revisando el álbum y encontró más fotografías del Dr. Vidal, siempre con la misma expresión imposible, excepto en una donde aparecía sonriendo ligeramente mientras observaba a un paciente dormido. En la última página del álbum había un recorte periódico con el titular, Trágico suceso en el Hospital Psiquiátrico San Rafael. El artículo, fechado en marzo de 1956, relataba brevemente cómo el Dr. Ernesto Vidal había sido encontrado muerto en circunstancias sospechosas en la habitación 23, después de años de rumores sobre sus métodos poco ortodoxos con los pacientes. Daniel cerró el álbum, sintiendo un escalofrío que no tenía nada que ver con la temperatura del lugar. Consultó su reloj, las 2:15 de la madrugada. Fue entonces cuando lo escuchó. Pasos lentos y metódicos recorriendo el pasillo exterior. Pasos que se detenían frente a cada puerta momentáneamente antes de continuar. Recordó la advertencia de Teresa, pero su curiosidad profesional fue más fuerte. Se levantó y se asomó al pasillo. Estaba vacío, pero los pasos continuaban sonando, ahora acercándose a la oficina. Daniel permaneció inmóvil, observando cómo las luces parpadeaban a medida que el sonido avanzaba. Los pasos se detuvieron justo frente a él, aunque no había nadie visible. Un frío intenso invadió el espacio, y Daniel sintió una presencia ineludible justo delante, como si alguien estuviera examinándolo minuciosamente. ¿Quién está ahí? Preguntó, su voz apenas un susurro. No hubo respuesta, pero los pasos reanudaron su marca, ahora alejándose hacia la habitación 23. Daniel los siguió, casi hipnotizado por la cadencia regular del sonido contra el suelo de linóleo. Cuando llegó a la habitación 23, la puerta estaba abierta. Ana seguía dormida, pero su respiración era irregular, como si estuviera teniendo una pesadilla intensa. Daniel entró y comprobó sus constantes vitales. Todo parecía normal, excepto por un detalle perturbador. En el suelo junto a la cama había huellas húmedas que no correspondían a las suyas. Huellas que venían de ninguna parte y terminaban junto a la cabecera de Ana. Mientras las observaba, las luces parpadearon violentamente y se apagaron por completo, sumiendo la habitación en la oscuridad. Daniel sacó su teléfono para usar la linterna, pero el dispositivo estaba completamente descargado, aunque lo había cargado completamente antes de comenzar su turno. In the darkness, he heard Anna's voice, though when he looked at her, he saw that she was still asleep. He chooses every night. Sometimes a patient, sometimes a doctor, said the voice, which now seemed to come from everywhere. Tonight he has chosen you. Daniel backed away towards the door, but when he turned he discovered that it had disappeared. There was only wall where the exit had been. This isn't real, he told himself. It's a hallucination, maybe I've been contaminated by some medicine. Everyone says the same thing at first, replied Anna's voice now right behind him. Daniel turned abruptly. Anna was still in bed, but she was now sitting up, her eyes open and completely white, without iris or pupil. Dr. Vidal needs a new assistant, she continued. Someone to help him with his experiments. The previous ones didn't last long. The lights suddenly came back on, but the room was no longer the same. The walls were covered with old medical instruments, rusty scalpels, trepanators, huge syringes. Anna's bed had been transformed into a metal operating table where a figure now lay strapped down, covered in a sheet. What's going on? Daniel exclaimed, panic rising inside him. A clearing of his throat made him turn. There, next to an old desk that wasn't there before, sat a middle-aged man with round glasses. The Dr. Vidal from the photo album, with the same eerie smile from the photograph. Welcome, Dr. Garcia, Vidal said, his voice a harsh whisper. I've been watching you for a while. I think you have potential for my work. Daniel tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He tried to scream, but no sound came out of his throat. "Don't resist," Vidal continued, standing up. "Everyone does at first, but eventually they understand that there's no escape from room 23. Not after you've been chosen." Vidal walked over to the covered figure and pulled back the sheet in one fluid motion. Daniel froze in horror as he saw himself on the operating table, unconscious and pale. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Vidal commented, taking a scalpel from the wall. "The duality of being. The body and consciousness separated. It's what I've been studying all these years." He approached Daniel with the scalpel in hand. "And now, with your help, we will continue the research. Forever." The lights flickered for the last time and everything went dark. The next morning, Teresa found the nursing office empty. Rounds hadn't been completed and reports were half-written. Dr. Garcia had disappeared. As she passed room 23, she noticed Ana awake, staring out the window. "Good morning, Ana. Have you seen Dr. Garcia?" she asked. Ana turned slowly. Her eyes, once brown, were now a dark green, similar to the missing doctor's. "Dr. Garcia doesn't work here anymore," she replied in a voice Teresa didn't recognize. "But don't worry, I'm sure the next doctor they assign will be perfectly capable." Teresa instinctively stepped back. There was something different about Ana, something fundamentally changed. That same afternoon, the hospital assigned Dr. Miguel Torres to the night shift in the East Wing. "Be careful with room 23, Teresa warned her as she handed her the master keys. "Patients who sleep there tend to change." And in room 23, Ana Herrera smiled, her new green eyes shining with anticipation as footsteps began to sound in the hallway, even though it was still broad daylight. The lost message. Sonia found the phone during a hike in the woods. It was partially buried in wet leaves and dirt, as if someone had tried to hide it. It was an old model, one of those flip-top ones that were popular over a decade ago. She picked it up out of curiosity, surprised that it still turned on when she pressed the power button. The screen glowed with a weak light, revealing 43% battery. Sonia looked around, but she was completely alone on that stretch of trail. The Navafria forest was not very busy at that time of year, especially on weekdays. She had chosen that day precisely to avoid meeting other hikers. For a moment she considered taking the phone to the town's civil guard, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the photo gallery, hoping to find some clue about the owner. Perhaps there were family photos or some document that could help her identify him. The gallery was empty except for a single image. A photograph apparently taken in that same forest, but in an area Sonia did not recognize. The picture showed an old stone well partially covered by vines. Nothing particularly interesting except for the date. The photo had been taken exactly 1 year earlier at the same time. Sonia flipped to the call log. Empty. Then she checked the messages. There was only one, unread, received at 3:33 a.m. the day before. The sender was listed as unknown, and the message consisted of 2 words. "I found you." A chill ran down her spine. It was probably nothing, she thought. Maybe the owner had lost the phone during a hike and someone had sent that message to the wrong number. She put the device in her jacket pocket and continued her walk, trying to forget the eerie coincidence of dates. The path narrowed as she went, and the trees seemed to lean over the path, blocking more and more sunlight. After half an hour of walking, Sonia consulted the map on her own phone. According to the app, she should be near an area with picnic tables, but she didn't see any. Perhaps she had strayed from the main trail without realizing it. She decided to retrace her steps, but something caught her eye. Between the trees, about 50 meters off the trail, she saw a stone structure. She squinted to make it out better. It was a well. Exactly like the one in the photograph. Curiosity and a strange feeling pushed her to leave the path and approach it. Sure enough, it was the same well in the picture, with the same climbing vines partially covering its old stones. Sonia pulled out the found phone and compared. There was no doubt it was the same place. As she looked at the structure, she noticed something she hadn't seen in the photograph. An inscription carved into one of the stones. The letters were partially erased by time, but could still be read, 1888, "Do not look inside." A warning that, of course, did exactly the opposite of what was intended. Sonia walked to the edge of the well and leaned down to look inside. The darkness was absolute, impossible to know how deep it was. She pulled out her phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. The beam of light barely penetrated a few meters before being absorbed by the blackness. But she managed to see something that left her paralyzed. The inner wall of the well was covered with names and dates, carved into the stone. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. And right at the height where she could see, freshly carved, was her own name, Sonia, October 15, 2024. Today's date. She backed away, tripping over a root and falling to the wet ground. This had to be a practical joke. Someone had left that phone on purpose for her to find. Maybe they had followed her from the start of the trail. She looked around frantically, but there was still no one in sight. The found phone vibrated in her pocket. With trembling fingers, Sonia pulled it out and saw a new message notification. Look behind you. Panic made her jump up and spin around. There was no one. Just trees and more trees, gently swaying in the breeze. Her own phone rang then, signaling the arrival of an email. It was from an unknown sender with a subject line that chilled her blood. Last chance to escape from the well. The email had no content, just an attachment. A picture. With shaking hands, Sonia downloaded it and opened it. It was a photograph of herself, taken from behind, apparently seconds before, when she was looking into the well. In the image, a pale, skeletal hand could clearly be seen emerging from the darkness, about to grab her hair. A hand that hadn't been there when she looked in. The found phone vibrated again. A new message. Too late. Sonia dropped both phones and ran toward the path, tripping over roots and branches. Desperation gave her strength, but the path seemed to have vanished. Where there had once been a clear path, there were now only identical trees in every direction. After what seemed like an eternity of aimless running, she stopped, panting, trying to get her bearings. She pulled out the emergency compass she always carried with her. The needle kept spinning as if the north had disappeared. The sun was beginning to set, and with it the temperature was rapidly dropping. Sonia knew she shouldn't panic. She was an experienced hiker. She had provisions, water, and a thermal blanket in her backpack. She could spend the night in the woods if necessary, and with daylight it would be easier to find her way back. She looked for a suitable place to camp and found a small clearing. As she prepared a makeshift shelter with a thermal blanket, she heard a sound that made her hair stand on end, the ringtone of the found phone. But that was impossible. She had dropped it next to the well miles away. The sound was coming from her own backpack. With trembling fingers, she opened the front pocket. There was the old phone ringing insistently. The screen showed incoming call, you. Before she could react, her own phone started ringing too. The screen indicated that the call was coming from the number of the found phone. Sonia turned off both devices and put them in her backpack. Something was happening that she couldn't explain, but she had to stay calm. She just needed to survive until dawn. Night fell quickly, enveloping the forest in an almost tangible darkness. Sonia turned on her headlamp and finished preparing her shelter. She sat, wrapped in the thermal blanket, with her back against a tree, determined to stay awake. At midnight, the flashlight began to flicker until it went out completely. Sonia searched her backpack for the spare batteries, but they weren't where she remembered putting them. In fact, nothing in her backpack seemed to be in its usual place. As she searched blindly, her fingers touched something cold and metallic that she didn't remember packing. She pulled it out to examine it in the weak moonlight. It was an old iron key, rusty and heavy. It had an intricate design on the handle with symbols she didn't recognize. A creaking of branches alerted her. Someone or something was moving through the trees, circling the clearing where she stood. Sonia stood still, holding her breath, hoping it was just a nocturnal animal. The creaking stopped, but was replaced by something worse. The unmistakable sound of stone scraping against stone, as if someone were carving something into a rock. And then a whisper so close to her ear that she felt the cold breath. I found the key. Now I can get out. Sonia tried to scream, but no sound came out of her throat. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only stand there, paralyzed by an indescribable terror, as she felt a presence move in front of her. In the dim moonlight, she saw a crouching figure, its movements spasmodic and unnatural. The figure approached slowly, dragging with it a smell of damp earth and rot. When it was close enough, Sonia could make out its face, or what was left of it. A misshapen mass of putrid flesh with two black holes where eyes should be. The mouth, a jagged, lipless opening, contorted into a horrible imitation of a smile. The creature raised a skeletal hand in which it held a familiar object, the old telephone. It flipped it open and began typing with misshapen fingers, its nails so long they looked like claws. Sonia's phone, still off, lit up in her pocket. She had a new message. Thank you for freeing me. Now take my place. The creature lunged at her with impossible speed. Sonia finally managed to move, but only to fall backwards as if the ground beneath her had suddenly disappeared. She fell in absolute darkness, while a heart-wrenching scream escaped her throat. The air grew increasingly cold and humid, and the smell of earth and ancient stone filled her nostrils. She realized with horror that she was falling into the well. After what seemed like an eternity, the impact came. But it was not against the bottom of the well, but against soft earth. Stunned, Sonia opened her eyes. She was lying on the main path, exactly where she had begun her walk hours before. She slowly sat up, confused. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination caused by some toxic plant she had inadvertently touched? Her backpack was next to her, apparently intact. She opened it to check its contents. Everything was in its place. Her phone was there too, working normally. A sigh of relief escaped her lips. Whatever it was over. She stood up, ready to head back to her car and forget about this strange experience. It was then that she noticed a strange feeling in her jacket pocket. Something that wasn't there before. She reached in and pulled out the old flip phone. Panic returned, but she forced herself to calm down. Maybe she really had found that phone and everything else had been a figment of her imagination. She flipped the phone open to check. The screen lit up, displaying a single new message. "Look at your hands." Sonia looked down at her hands and screamed. Her fingers were now long and bony, with yellowed nails curved like claws. The skin, once smooth and tanned, was now pale and wrinkled, with flecks of dirt embedded so deeply that they seemed part of its texture. She dropped the phone and ran to a small nearby stream to see her reflection in the water. The face that stared back at her was not her own. It was the deformed, rotting face she had seen in the woods. Her own phone rang with a notification of a new message. With trembling fingers no longer recognizable as her own, she pulled it out and read. "Now it's you who's waiting in the well. And soon, very soon, someone will find your phone in the woods." 2 weeks later, a hiker named Laura found a modern phone during a walk through the Navafria forest. It was partially buried in wet leaves and dirt, as if someone had tried to hide it. When she turned it on, there was only one photo in the gallery, a picture of an old stone well. And a single unread message that read, "I found you.